Episode 80, Tomatoes and Other Foreign Fruits, the Conundrum. Hello, and welcome to the History of American Food. This week I'll be looking into the what's local, what's foreign, what's civilized problem, but instead of the potato-centric vegetable point of view, it's all fruit all the time, even the ones we tend to use like vegetables. That's right, it's time to draw the lines around what started here, what's been naturalized as American food, and what's still kind of a stranger. But of course, what we really care about is what the 18th century thought about it all. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is not only was I a chemistry teacher, I started out as a biology kid. So while I will call pumpkins or cucumbers or tomatoes vegetable in passing, after all, it's the correct kingdom. They aren't animals. They belong with the fruits when I'm coming up with food divisions. But don't worry, I've passed the age where I need to correct you while you're making a salad. So last week we looked at how just about every last vegetable used by the colonist was an import, except for sweet potatoes. So this week it's time to examine the fruits. And fruits, they are just as scrambled. And the ones drawing most of my attention are, once again, South American Solanaceae, or what we know as the family of nightshades. There are some exotic fruits that have stayed exotic all during their presence in North America. The pineapple, the mango, the banana, passion fruit. Every time they show up, there's a little part of my brain that lights up with vacation or tropical or special somehow in ways that it doesn't for other items that are from just as far away. The first example of this is lemons. To us modern eaters, they seem seasonless, and lemon juice is just about as ubiquitous as sugar in our prepared foods. If you look at the labels of foods, you'll see lemon juice in all sorts of places you haven't thought of. And if you count citric acid, the active ingredient in lemon juice that's important as a preservative, a pH balancer, and a flavor booster, the ghost of lemons is in even more places. Yet, as we learned earlier, lemons are from eastern India, only slightly closer than the origin of cloves, sugar, and pepper. But as we know, they were established in the Americas by the time the English got serious about being a colonial power. So while they were still pretty fancy in the 18th century, they weren't strange and arresting the way pineapples were. Because lemons have so many of their own personal weapons to fight off rot, they were pretty easy to move around and they grew pretty cooperatively. They were easy to add to a landscape, not quite as easy as apples, but realistically not that much harder. Just walk around any Southern California suburb established before about 1980. There are a lot of lemon trees. Another example is peaches. For heaven's sakes, Georgia prides itself as the peach state. As a tiny child with relatives there, I had assumed Georgia was the font of all things peach. In high school and college, I had to readjust my brain as I learned of Momotaro, a Japanese folktale that revolved around a peach, and saw peaches woven through even the very limited amount of Chinese art and poetry I encountered. But I can be forgiven for my earlier confusion since early English explorers and colonists assumed peaches were native to North America because the Native Americans along the East Coast had planted peaches everywhere they would grow just as soon as they ended up with some peach pits from the trees the Spanish had planted in La Florida. And unlike the imported pears and plums, which had native pears and plums to cross with and make prickly, disappointing hybrids, peaches tended to stay juicy and pleasing. So those fruits were naturalized before England planted its America seeds. Fair enough. I can cut some slack for the colonists for thinking peaches were local and lemons were always around on the Americas side of the Atlantic. And then there's fruits like cucumbers, apples, plums, pears, raspberries, blackberries, cherries, currants, apricots, gooseberries, mulberries, which are considered normal English and thus normal colonial fruits, even though they were imported from the get-go. These were the plants packed along and planted as soon as there was a spot to do so. Non-English colonists added to this tradition, bringing along their favorite varieties and made the impression that these were fruits of the Americas even more plausible. As I've dug deeper, it does seem odd that we only have a tradition of apple brandy in this country and never developed one for plum brandy. I mean, we had plenty of German colonists who had a tradition of plum brandy and Central European colonists with a strong Slivovitz background and good gravy, plenty of plums. Oh well. Raspberries, plums, blackberries, and mulberries also have North American versions, which were essential in producing some of the more popular contemporary and modern cultivated hybrids. But until the 19th century, when plant hybridization became all the rage in the colonies, the local versions were often overlooked or ignored, partly due to the colonial anti-foraging sentiment and the fact that hybridization wasn't something the average farmer thought about, much less the more or less non-farmers who were still doing a lot of the colonial farming in the 18th century. Making things all the more confusing, later waves of immigration would regard the hybrids, purposeful and escapees, they found out on the frontier as native plants, just like early colonists had assumed peaches were locals. Beyond the imports that were given honorary native status, there were also native plants that did get absorbed into colonial cuisine rather thoroughly. Cranberries are the easy one. Almost everyone can identify them as originally an American fruit. They were added to the colonial pantry pretty quickly, mainly as a tonic and medicine, as they are ferociously astringent when they are plain. But once apples and sugars become a more common ingredient, there are plenty of sauces, puddings, pies, and cordials. An overseas trade in cranberries with England also developed. They worked as an anti-scorbutic, that is, a food that kept the scurvy away, so were included in sea rations. And they were shipped back pickled and dried, which caused a funny little quirk to develop between colonial and home country menus. Harvest time feasts in the colonies and later Thanksgiving in America featured sauce made from fresh cranberries, straight from their late summer and fall harvest. But the cranberries preserved in a variety of ways would make their way back to England and appear as a Christmas chutney or other condiment. England has plenty of its own harvest dishes to choose from, so needed nothing else for those fall events, but a bright red dish at the darkest time of the year was most welcome. Blueberries are also a native crop of North America, but they have a close cousin called whortleberry or bilberry in Europe. The American blueberry stayed seasonal in small time until the 20th century, but were appreciated seasonally and locally, and like cranberries, were preserved and spread about almost the instant sugar became cheaper. Because they are not as easily preserved and more pleasant to eat fresh, and a similar cousin existed across the Atlantic, no export trade in them developed. And then there's the surprise berry, strawberries. They are native to the Americas, and wild versions can be found on both coasts. Like chocolate and sweet potatoes, they were first imported to Europe by Spanish explorers and sprinkled about the continent starting in about the 16th century. Strawberries are prolific spreaders, partly by seed but mainly by runners, their little roots jumping over all sorts of pot edges and barriers. So anywhere they take root, as long as they're not frozen too hard, they will just appear and wander all over, which is how the modern garden strawberry got its start. Fascinated by this tiny, intense American fruit, several varieties were dropped off by Portuguese and Spanish sailors and travelers in Scotland, in England, in Spain, in Portugal, and France. The French were messing about with the plants in their fancy pants research greenhouses. Remember that La Farenne guy? So anyway, a meeting of the plants occurred. A larger, juicier, sweeter hybrid made itself under the cover of, well, plant cover, scandal, unauthorized plant sex, and from there, the strawberry hybrid race was launched. Even though strawberries are of entirely America's origin, the earliest culinary writings about them come from Europe and mainly French chefs. In fact, the American continental origin of the strawberry is so regularly forgotten that when people mention the only fruits native to North America marketed globally, they always leave out strawberries. I mean, I've been reading about food for a while here, but it is only now that I was finally aware that strawberries are entirely a fruit from the Americas. Sure, they got sophisticated and met cream in Europe, but they are from the Americas, and we forget that. So those berries of the Americas have been absorbed into American food more thoroughly than the much larger pumpkin of earlier notoriety. Despite its head start, in the U.S., our use of pumpkins in food is far more limited than its use in the rest of the Americas and Asia as well. The current excitement over the Japanese kabocha squash in online recipes shows our lack of imagination in earlier eras. Melons. Well, I have been long baffled by melons. Happily, I am not alone. They were distributed about Africa, India, Asia, and Europe by the time anyone was painting pictures on cloth anywhere. But petroglyphs, stone pictures in Central Africa and then Egypt, in combination with preliminary DNA work, has pretty much established they were originally African produce, and that they entered the Eurasian trade routes via Egypt, making it as far east as China, Korea, and even Japan by the 16th century. And then they went west to the Americas with the Portuguese and the Spanish. With the Portuguese helping things along, there seems to have been dual introductions in India and China due to overland introduction earlier and then coastal introductions where the Portuguese dropped off melon seeds with the potatoes and the tomatoes and, okay, I'll ruin my last thing, chili peppers. There are the musk-type melons, forebears to the American honeydew and cantaloupe. Those may have been native to Europe as well, but the watermelon types, due to their highly recognizable striped exterior, are much easier to pinpoint in the very oldest of pictures, so they can be placed originally in Central Africa. Watermelons were in Europe by at least the 12th century when the Hungarians were calling it the Greek melon. They made it further north, but were only grown for rich people in England because, too cold. Melon or puffed up pompion was the insult that led to the name of pumpkin, showing that English colonists were not that familiar with the sweet melons, and they were simply not part of early colonial cuisine, especially in the north. But watermelons grow fast, are drought tolerant, and let's face it, make a lot of seeds, so they were rapidly spread about the Caribbean, South America, and other early Spanish outposts, which means, like the peach, some early European explorers and colonists assumed melons were native to North America because they found them in the gardens of the locals, and on occasion running wild along a riverside where they had jumped out of a garden. They were definitely more prevalent in southern colonies than they were up north, but they did grow in warmer pockets, even in New England. However, a fair number of them didn't quite make it to ripeness, so pickled melons showed up in cookbooks, and a favorite style of pickling melons was to mango them. That's right, by the 18th century, the idea of the mango was very popular in the Anglosphere. Soldiers and sailors had encountered this nigh magical fruit ashore in India, Indonesia, and on any number of islands visited in the trade for spice and slaves. But if you think pineapples were hard to move around, mangoes were more impossible still. However, the Indian habit of pickling mangoes with mustard seed and chilies made an incredibly popular shipboard store and import good. And so, in the 18th century, many an English consumer had no idea that mango was a fruit. Rather, they understood it as a method for pickling, so instructions for mangoed melon start showing up in menus and pantry inventories. In the colonies, melons and summer squashes will both be preserved this way, along with peaches and even apples. But for fresh melons, there were not a large number of recipes since they were generally eaten fresh and ripe. The preferred texture of the watermelon of the day was sort of liquidy, truly calling to mind the water part. A melting sorbet texture was expected, and the fruit might even be bashed up with a spoon and then sipped as a cooling drink. The crunchy watermelon of today would have been considered underripe and tragic. The fact that Amelia Simmons has recipes for mangoed melons and even a way to turn unripe watermelon into, quote, American citron, that is, soaking the rind in sugar syrup to be used the way citron rind would be, shows that these were ubiquitous and familiar fruits during the 18th century because so many inventive uses had already been devised. So now, on to the nightshades, the ones that came from South America but came overseas and not overland. Colonial cooks seem to have been hesitant about using them. They required hints and encouragement from both European and African cooks to finally bring them into colonial and soon American cooking traditions. First, there's the tomato. Somehow in the late 20th century, it became almost the parsley of fruits, showing up like lemon wedges whether you asked for them or not, on your burger, in your salad, with your ham and cheese. How did this happen? Where are tomatoes from, and just when did they enter the colonial pantry? We'll get to the ubiquitous part in the 20th century, but for now, let's look at how this all got started. In the 15th century, nobody outside of its home range, the northern Andes in Central America and the Aztec Empire, thought much of the tomato. Most of the world had never even heard of it. But when the Spanish showed up in the 16th century and started carting back treasure of the greater and less obvious sorts, they also picked up the tomato. The Spanish palate already valued anchovies, dried hams, hard-aged cheeses, and other foods that rated high on the umami scale, so they picked up the tomato pretty quickly and ran with it. The Italian peninsula, which was the old home of garum, that is, European fish sauce, and also a place fond of umami-rich things like dried hams, hard cheeses, and so on, also made much of the tomato. The scholarship into 16th century North African cooking is not well developed in my English language reading sphere, but I find it nearly impossible to believe that North African ports and the Levant missed out on this new overseas treasure. Not with all the other trade that was going across, over, and around the Mediterranean. Tomatoes like warm weather, and probably, at least in the early years, liked the lack of tomato-eating pests. The fact that all these areas had exposure to eggplants, including oil-fried eggplants with plenty of garlic because that's just divine, the tomato was not a scary food. In fact, it was probably seen, if anything, a more friendly, easier to manipulate cousin of the eggplant. I have a feeling the readier access to olive oil probably helped as well. So the tomato moved right into the Iberian and Italian and Muslim pantry, sometimes alongside with the potato. It's true that several areas were too hot and arid for happy potatoes, so they never really caught on in those early days outside of the Iberian Peninsula. Besides, who needs potatoes when you have wheat and chickpeas and fava beans? Art is really helpful in unraveling the journey of the tomato. Just as the Smy Goodness podcast reminds me, look at the tables of food in paintings. They are such a great guide to what people were eating. And there they are. Tomatoes in Spanish still life paintings, just hanging in the Prado, waiting for anyone to just walk up and look at them. It is worth noting that those tomatoes were lobed and irregular, not the round or even ovoids we find in the store these days, and they were a dark, velvety red, which also marks them as fragile fruits that would not travel well. They were pulled from the garden at the peak of ripeness and then baked, stewed, pickled, made into sauces and pies, and even, as this craze for these salads spread about, eaten raw on occasion. In the 18th century, all sorts of lore grew up in Europe around the tomato. And then, in the 19th century, there was lore about the lore. One of the best remembered in the English language legend are the Victorian scary stories about how lovers used to dare each other to eat tomatoes in order to die together. Oh, the Victorians, they loved their stories of love and death. Pommes d'amour, indeed. That is, love apples. They also like to point out that the name was probably because they were red and heart-shaped, but that goes better with the Victorian invention of the Valentine cards. So these well-known explanations, like so many food legends I am finding, were made up later. Besides, the French call it tomate now. A request for pomme d'amour will only get you a candy-covered apple and maybe a strange look. Then there's the question about the Italian name pomodoro. Does that mean that the first tomatoes the Italians received were golden? So it was like pomodoro, golden apple? I mean, the fancy Italians with cookbooks initially regarded tomatoes as a peasant food as they grew close to the ground. If you recall all that nonsense from the humorism and solidism episode way back in season 1. A new thought is that they were initially called pomme des Moors, apple of the Moors. I mean, Moors was the name used for the Muslims so recently booted out of Spain by the Catholic kings at the end of the 15th century. The name Moor is linked to a Roman age misnomer, but that is a whole different etymological mystery. In a place and time where novel names for new things were laundered through several tongues by polyglot travelers who were heard and misheard, And then recorded in journals full of variable spellings, the actual origin of the Italian name and possibly the French name are lost to history. Because after all, in the 16th and 17th century, it was not uncommon for a native French speaker, and there were several dialects at that point, to keep a journal in French and Spanish and maybe Latin for the racy bits, and then throw in a bit of transliterated Arabic. Life trading around the Mediterranean at this time was not for the monolinguist. Anyway, the Spanish. They had encountered it as tomato from the Aztecs and brought it back with that name, tomate. And like so many other things, the tomato was another thing the Spanish dropped off in the Caribbean, which is where it seems to have finally gotten its entree into North America. The earliest tomato recipes in printed American cookbooks are from the 19th century, but the earliest reference to a tomato is in a botanical survey from 1710 in South Carolina. And by 1710, we know that there was many a refugee and expansionist from Barbados who had come to South Carolina to set up a new plantation or to expand a Barbadian enterprise. The colonists setting up in South Carolina brought the enslaved people who cooked, kept house, and gardened for them, along with the ones who worked in the fields on the cash crops. There were also an assortment of people who traveled back and forth from Saint-Domingue, or as we know it now, Haiti, and some were white, some were free-colored, and some were enslaved Africans or enslaved coloreds. The classifications, laws, and rules for the French colony were far more complex and nuanced than the colonial ones, or than we are taught or remember. West Africans were also familiar with a variety of eggplant, the way Mediterranean cooks were with theirs. In fact, the African eggplant species looks remarkably similar to the lobed tomato of old. So this Spanish drop-off would have been an easy and welcome addition to their vegetable-centered cooking style. After all, they had a sweet potato that was not quite a yam, so why not a tomato that's not quite an eggplant? The earliest 19th century recipes for tomato I've run across was for ochre or okra and tomatoes, and specifically called it out as a Caribbean dish. So there you go. The tomato came to North America first, not as an experiment in Thomas Jefferson's show garden, not as an ornament for fashionable tables of the gracious hospitality by Carolina hostesses, but rather as a garden fruit grown by enslaved gardeners, adding it to their daily pot. Because the tomato would not grow in England outside of greenhouses, colonists from England generally had little opinion about the tomato when they did run across it, except for maybe that it smelled funny. And if you do come upon very ripe tomatoes warmed by the sun, you can smell their close relationship to tobacco, especially the flowers and fruits that tobacco plants grow. The recognition that it might be poison, well, the English weren't entirely nuts on this one. Just as with potato leaves and even tobacco leaves, ingesting a reasonable amount is dangerous due to the high concentrations of alkaloids. The only non-poisonous part of the tomato is the fruit, and this seems to be due to the tomato looking for a way to get its seeds spread, with possibly some horticulture work done by the early Incan farmers. After all, they worked to develop and domesticate the non-poisonous potato tuber, so it's not unreasonable to assume that they improved and spread the wild tomato as well, which incidentally can still be found around the Andes. The English, on the other hand, were used to plants where if you could eat it, you could pretty much eat all of it, so you can see their problem with the tomato. Tomatoes became a Southern specialty in the 18th century and made a splash with the rich people Creole cuisine in New Orleans as the gumbos containing tomatoes became favorites. But they will remain a Southern food, since at this time they are seasonal, they are fragile, and they are persnickety about their growing conditions. There's barely any hope for them if you go any further north than Virginia. So, at this point, the tomato is an exotic, foreign, fragile fruit. And they don't take off in America until well into the next century, which gets us finally to our last lost fruit that made it to North America, definitely by the 18th century, if not a little earlier, the chili pepper. It will take a long time for these guys to make it north of the sweet potato line, but they are hanging out in the southern colonies, making their way into all sorts of foods, but kind of under the radar. Chilies, capsicum peppers, are the final member of the American nightshade family to gain worldwide fame. I mean, I guess they became world famous before tomatoes, but you know what I mean. If you remember, pepper, black pepper, was still rather expensive and a bit rare even in the wealthier, better established 18th century since it had to be all shipped in. Looking back, you might remember that pepper was one of the reasons Columbus was able to convince the Catholic kings to fund his wild venture. After all, back in the 15th century, a different route to the pricey and exclusive pepper, along with the cloves and the nutmeg and such, would have been a boon. Well, alas, no black pepper was to be found, but the Columbus expeditions did run across something else that tingled the tongue. What he encountered were small red berry-like fruits, so they were called red pepper to give them their proper place in this confusing spice universe. We forget, but there was black pepper, cubeb pepper, African pepper, Malagueta pepper, and so on. So why not red pepper? Which is how the whole confusing red chili pepper name came about. But unlike the tomato, which the Spanish spread into the Caribbean and elsewhere, the chili was already on the islands. It had already started its habit of becoming many varieties in many places. Less fussy than the tomato, it had also traveled into Central America and up into Mexico, so the Spanish would encounter it over and over and over, including in India, where the Portuguese dropped it off at the very end of the 15th century, or maybe the beginning of the 16th, along with North and West Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and China. No wonder no one seemed to know what the real source of the chili pepper was for a very long time. It was fully integrated into the spice trade by the 16th century, just when the spice trade was expanding by boat. All spices came from foreign parts, and as we learned in the turkey episode, most people weren't particularly over-worried about which foreign part was what. The chili pepper may have already been in the Texas area by the time the Spanish put down roots there, or it may not have. It's hard to tell. But they certainly added it to their gardens along with the lemons and the tomatoes. The variety that became popular first in South Carolina was brought from the Caribbean, probably from Jamaica. This was the bird pepper. Smaller and hotter than the cayenne, which seems to have come from Mexico, the bird pepper was responsible for the first colonial hot sauces and was the pepper they meant in recipes that called for one dried red pepper pod. The habit of pickling vegetables in vinegar made the vinegar-based hot sauce an obvious thing to happen. And this same pepper will show up in some of those earliest barbecue mop sauces that came out of Virginia. While the northern colonies had to import their pepper, in the southern colonies, why bother when you could grow your own? Especially for those people who didn't have the cash to spare for fancy spices. And so, by the 18th century, all of these imported fruits are a fixture in some part or most of the colonies, while pumpkins, the earliest recognized local fruit, sort of gets tossed to the edges. From the very start, we were always dissatisfied with what was right in front of us. Even in our fruits and vegetables, the things that were from far away were immediately more interesting. It seems as if we've never been particularly interested in developing a deep and varied cuisine from what we had right in front of us. America has always been on the lookout for the next big thing from somewhere else. So now that I have tomato in my sights, it is time to talk ketchup next week. What's its history? Where did it come from? What did it look like in the colonies? And when did tomatoes get involved? Thanks for listening. Show notes for this episode will be at thehistoryofamericanfood.blogspot.com. Any email, questions, or quibbles will reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Thanks to everyone who has left a comment or sent me questions or book recommendations. Along with promised pictures and links, I'll also include any interesting media I consumed for the episode. Music for this podcast is Fingerlympics by Dr. Turtle. The link to the show notes is also in the show's Twitter, Insta, and post.news bio at THOA Food and in the show description.